Hello, this is Tony Rayns giving you commentary for some scenes or some sections of the film Touch of Zen by King Hu, made in Taiwan, 1967 through 1969, and finally premiered in 1971 in something like an integral version, restored to its actual integral version in 75, and then shown in the Cannes Film Festival, where it won the Grand Prix for technique, not the Palme d'Or, that is, but nonetheless a significant prize, the first one won by a Chinese film. These credits, unlike King's later films of the 1970s, are not in his own calligraphy. He specialised in, he had a rather distinctive form of calligraphy, very idiosyncratic, and he liked to use it on the main titles of his films. Not in this case. These credits are designed to look rather like old woodblock characters as used in early forms of printing in China, and that means that they are designed to evoke the book, Liao Jai Zhi, or in English translation, Strange Stories from a Chinese Studio, which is a collection written at the very end of the Ming Dynasty by a man called Pu Songling, and one of the very short stories in that collection inspired the film. He's credited rather prominently on this, although in fact only the first hour of the film bears any real relationship to the story. Now, we're going to talk very generally about King Hu, about the production background. The International Film Company, whose credit you saw at the very beginning, was a company set up specifically to make this film because it was a big, ambitious film made on the back of King's enormous success with his previous film, Dragon Gate Inn. And I think that this was in fact the only production of international films, because this film went rather over budget and certainly over schedule, and I don't think the company ever fully recovered. Anyhow, we'll come back to this a bit later on in the context of Taiwan production of the time. Let's talk now a little bit about the film. As you notice, it begins with these non-human images. It has a lengthy introduction without any dialogue or indeed any human presence. First time we see the protagonist Gu Shengchai is nearly 5 minutes into the film, and it's 7 minutes into the film before anybody speaks. So this is one of the great wordless introductions in film history, I think. These images that we are seeing, the spider trapping some kind of moth, I guess it is, in its web, followed by shots of the mist, the mountains, the long grasses with white tops and so on. These are what we might think of as Taoist images, and the story that inspired the film and the collection that it came from are also fundamentally Taoist. Most ghosts in China are Taoist ghosts. And this film has strong Taoist origins. Again, we'll come back to that a little bit later on, because the title of the film references Buddhism, which is the alternative current of spirituality in modern China. And the film in some sense shows Buddhism trumping Taoism, as indeed trumping everything else, trumping politics, trumping the mundane affairs of everyday life and so on. Taoism, we're not going to go into a long definition of Taoism here and now, this isn't the time or place, but suffice it to say that the Force in the Star Wars series was inspired by Taoism. There is a notion that there is a current in nature that somehow runs through both physical landscapes and the affairs of men, that needs to be channeled in order to produce the desired result. And the Force is seen to do it in say modern science fiction terms. Taoism proposes that if one is in tune with the natural currents of nature, the natural world, that one will achieve desired results. There are many ramifications to this, such as the fact that Taoism offers a sort of lunar opposite to the sun of Buddhism. It's not by accident that the moon appears so many times in the first hour or so of this film, whereas the sun dominates the proceedings towards the end. And it's not an accident that ghosts or the threat or rumours of ghosts appear only in these opening scenes. Now, this long exploration of the ruined and abandoned Jinglu fort, which turns out to be a crucial setting for the first 2 hours of the film, because it's partly because it's where Gu and his mother live. It's also where Ms. Yang and her supporters base themselves when they're refugees in this region. Now, the reason that this overgrown, ruined fort gets so much emphasis here is not just because the imagery, evokes a certain Taoist sensibility, or that the location turns out to be an important setting for the coming action in the film, but also because King and his team, most of them trained by him, built it themselves and then waited for nearly a year for the vegetation to grow, the grasses in particular to grow to the requisite height that they needed for later images in the film. This is a ruined fort that they constructed as an outdoor standing set and had to allow to become overgrown in the way that any real fort in this situation would have become. They also built, of course, this other outdoor standing set of the small town where Gu Shengchai, that's his nameplate, has his calligraphy shop. And I think we should note probably at this point that this is unique in Chinese cinema up to this point, that a director takes so much time, trouble and care and detail to show the everyday life of a character like Gu Shengchai, who is an impoverished scholar, educated beyond his circumstances, but not personally ambitious to enter the civil service, which is the traditional way forward for somebody in his position. But instead he has set up this small enterprise shop. He's staying with his mother because he feels, I think, that she needs looking after. And these details of how he runs and operates the shop, what's in the shop, the tools of his trade, the heater that keeps things warm and keeps water boiling for tea. All of these details are lovingly represented in the film, and King takes time over it in a way that most commercial directors would not have done, certainly at this time, but probably even subsequently. Because he wants to establish what life is like for a certain class of person in the late Ming dynasty. Now, the introduction of Ouyang Nian, who turns out to be one of the film's bad guys, not one of the senior bad guys, but actually the most junior of the bad guys, apart from his, the men he commands, is presented in a consciously Leone-like way. As you will see in a moment, we get a very tight close-up of his eyes in a way that is very familiar from the Leone westerns made a few years before this. They had an enormous influence on Chinese cinema in general, popular Chinese cinema in general. Can be seen very vividly in many Hong Kong films of the mid-60s and late 60s. And King was by no means immune to that kind of influence, and by opting for a close-up of the actor's eyes, the actor being Tian Peng, he's making a conscious reference to an idiom that has become familiar to his audience at this point, thanks to Sergio Leone specifically. Now, I think this is clear enough in terms of the action for us not to need to detail anything further about it at this point. So I'm going to divert from scene-specific commentary here and talk something about King Hu himself. King was born, his Chinese name, let's say first, was Hu Jinquan. He was born in 1931 in what we now think of as Beijing. At that time it was Beiping. Beijing means northern capital, and it was not the capital at the time. The Kuomintang had moved the capital south, so it was renamed Beiping, which means northern peace. So it was in Beiping that he was born in 31. He was rather scholarly and artistic in his interests from childhood. He was very fascinated by the writings, in particular of Lao Shi, a distinguished modern novelist and playwright who specialized in Beijing's own dialect and was very much concerned with the city's history and its particular character. But King was one of the people who fled to Hong Kong in 1949 as the communist victory approached, and he entered Hong Kong along with a wave of other mainlanders who were nervous about what the future might hold under communism in 1949. And he established himself in the film industry in Hong Kong completely by accident, because friends of his who were working in film, other immigrants from the mainland, other refugees from the Civil War of the late 40s, were working in film, and they introduced him to work in film, notably at the beginning as a art director or props man, somebody taking care of things, occasionally painting, using his calligraphic skills to paint posters or front of house displays for cinemas. And from that, he found himself being asked to make acting appearances in films. And in the late 50s, after quite a long period of bit work in films, which was supplementing, or actually it was in addition to his main job, which was working as a broadcaster for Voice of America Radio in Hong Kong. So he was well known as a broadcaster, and also famous as one of the first people to drive a Cadillac around Hong Kong, thanks to his American connections. He was hired by Shaw Brothers at the end of the 1950s. His close friend Li Hanxiang, the most prolific and ambitious of the Shanghai refugees who had fetched up in Hong Kong and started directing films in Hong Kong, had signed a contract with Shaw Brothers in 1958. Shaw Brothers was new at that time. Before that, it had been Shaw and Sons, another company run by another of the brothers. But Run Shaw, the youngest of the four Shaw brothers, came to Hong Kong to take over and revive the business, which was not in great shape. And he launched Shaw Brothers as a new company and hired Li Hanxiang to direct its very first major production, which was a film called a historical spectacle called The Kingdom and the Beauty. Well, King Hu followed his friend and colleague Li Hanxiang into Shaw Brothers, but he was signed on as a screenwriter and as an actor. He does, in fact, appear in quite a few Shaw Brothers films of the late 50s, early 60s as a bit player, and he became quite well known to the audience, in fact, and his name is also on some films as screenwriter. But in '62, he started hankering to direct, and his first film, in fact, was a version of an opera, a Peking opera called The Story of Suzanne. By coincidence, or perhaps not by coincidence, who knows, it's the opera featured in the closing scene of Jia Zhangke's film A Touch of Sin. You see a performance of it in the courtyard outside a factory in Shanxi province. And he went on from that to help Li Hanxiang to finish a film called The Love Etern. This was being rushed through production at Shaw Brothers because a rival version of the same story was being made at the other major studio, Cathay. And there was such a rush to complete that Li Hanxiang had no choice but to ask his friend to direct a few scenes to speed up the production of the film, so while they were working in two units simultaneously. So King Hu was credited as associate director on The Love Etern. After that, he directed two more films for Shaw Brothers by himself. The first was a war film called Sons of the Good Earth, and the second was his first martial arts film, or wuxia film, called Come Drink With Me, which had a very distinctive idiosyncratic tone, which was very fresh for the genre, and served as one of the engines that powered a new form of Mandarin language martial arts films at the time. There was another director at Shaw Brothers called Zhang Shi, who was also making a kind of name for himself at around the same moment, and he also started making macho action films starring the ex-swimmer Wang Yu, known as Jimmy Wang Yu later. But King's films were more aesthetic, more subtle, more feminine, and altogether wittier than I think Zhang Che's work, which was clearly very masculine and macho in its orientation. After making Come Drink With Me, which was a surprise hit for Shaw Brothers, King left the company. He had been contracted, as we said, only as a screenwriter and actor, so he'd been directing without a director's contract, and that made it fairly easy for him to slip away. In later years, other people at Shaw Brothers who got tired of the grinding production schedules and the very low wages had more trouble slipping away from Shaw Brothers and found themselves subject to legal action for trying to break their contracts or working outside the studio. But King got away with it fairly quickly, and he was following the example of, once again, his dear friend and colleague Li Hanxiang. Li Hanxiang had left Shaw's. His contract had expired and he declined to renew it and went instead to Taiwan, where he saw new opportunities. And he set up his own film company. In Chinese it was called Guolian. In English it was known as the Grand Film Company. Taiwan cinema was virtually non-existent at the time. There was a certain amount of filmmaking in Taiwan in the early mid-60s, and what little there was mostly controlled and run by the Kuomintang government, the KMT as it became known in the Western world. And they were producing anti-communist propaganda films, and later on also a lot of melodramas, so-called literary films that were based on romantic novels. But we haven't got the time or the space here really to go into a proper history of Taiwan cinema, but it must be said that the key thing to establish is that Taiwan lacked the infrastructure of a large-scale film industry. There were few trained personnel, there were no independent producers, there were no other big film companies than the one run and owned by the government itself. So Grand was a pioneering initiative to set up a rival to the government's film company, known as the Central Motion Picture Corporation. And Li Hanxiang was very ambitious and became, in fact, too ambitious because he bankrupted the company after only about 6 years, during which time he had directed a number of films for them himself, including at least a couple of major classics in his career, but also produced a number of films by other directors. King Hu followed him to Taiwan, didn't direct for Grand, Li Hanxiang's own company, which is an interesting thing. I never heard from King why he chose not to work for Grand, but instead he went to the people who had been distributing Grand's productions in Taiwan. As we said, there was no major established infrastructure for a film business in Taiwan, so some investors had come into business specifically to distribute Grand's productions in a way that would obviate any need to rely on the government Central Motion Picture Corporation. So they would show in other theatres and they would not rely on the Central Motion Picture circuit or indeed its production and distribution mechanisms. So these people, because of the success of early Grand productions, had themselves become ambitious to produce films. They were, however, experienced, well, insofar as they were experienced at all, they were experienced as distributors, not as producers. King Hu went to them and they founded a company, another new company called Union Films. And Union produced Dragon Gate Inn, King Hu's first Taiwan production, released in 1966, or made in 66 and released in 67. And an enormous hit in Taiwan, the most successful martial arts film ever made at that point. It subsequently took box offices by storm right across the region, everywhere that Taiwan films could be shown, which means Malaysia, Singapore and such, Thailand. Anywhere there was a significant Chinese audience, the film did equally well. And it was blocked from release in Hong Kong by Shaw Brothers, who were vindictive and vengeful. They were still very angry that King had walked out on them after making a hit, and they were determined that this film would not be shown in Hong Kong until they had had a chance to make their own rival attraction that could be put out ahead of the Hong Kong release of Dragon Gate Inn. This is the way, in fact, it happened, but Dragon Gate Inn, nonetheless, when it came out in Hong Kong, was an enormous success there too, famously outgrossing the then top box office champion, The Sound of Music. Now, it was on the strength of this wild success with Dragon Gate Inn that King was able to undertake Touch of Zen. And the company, the people at Union formed a new company, International, whose logo you saw at the beginning of the film, specifically to make this film, and King explained that this would be a very big production, that he would need to build outdoor sets and let them naturally age so that the vegetation could grow to the requisite height and such like. And that's what he did. So the film was in fact something like 2 years in production. It finished shooting, I believe, in 1969. By that time it was clear that it was going to be a film lasting around 3 hours. And the distributors were not very pleased about this because release patterns were inflexible and pretty much carved in stone, in fact. There were regular time slots. The entire audience was geared to expect films to open or to play at regular, predictable times. and this would be a film that wouldn't fit that bill. And although Li Hanxiang's film company Grand had made a huge spectacle called The Beauty of Beauties, or Xi Shi, which had exceeded the 2-hour running time, that had been a flop. It had been an expensive flop. It had been, in fact, the film that was the author of Grand's downfall, in a way. So that was a cautionary example before them all, and they were very keen that the film should fit into established slots for exhibition, and therefore were not pleased to be presented with a film that was going to be 3 hours long. So they experimented with various forms of the film. They first tried cutting it in half. The famous fight in the bamboo forest occurs at almost exactly the midpoint, about 90 minutes into the film. So they ended the film right after the fight in the bamboo forest and called that part 1, and then started part 2 with a repeat of the scene of the fight in the bamboo forest, and then took it to the end and tried to release it in 2 parts. Not surprisingly, perhaps, this didn't work. They then tried re-editing the film into a single film of less than 2 hours duration. That opened, I believe, in 1971, and that also flopped with the audience. By this time, we should say, a lot had changed in martial arts cinema. There had been a flood of many other swordplay films in the wuxia tradition, but by 1971 there were also the new kung fu films, which had been ushered in Hong Kong by Shaw Brothers with films like King Boxer, also known in the States as Five Fingers of Death, made by the Korean director Chung Chang-ho, and by Golden Harvest with their first films featuring the adult Bruce Lee. Well, this sudden glut of macho action films had rather queered the pitch for a film like Touch of Zen, which was far more aesthetic, much slower, much more elaborate, much more teasing, much less straightforwardly melodramatic than most of the films being made in Hong Kong. And I think no matter what the producers at International did to try and alter the structure and shape of the film, it was never likely to make it a hit of the kind that they were looking for, or the kind that Dragon Gate Inn had been just a few years previously. Well, King interrupted this process. Actually, I think the editing of the film, or the re-editing of the film, was taken out of his hands by the producers, who they themselves tried various different forms of it for release, as we said. King, meanwhile, went off to try and contribute to try and save Grand, which we noted was going bankrupt at the time. And he contributed an episode called Anger, based on a Peking opera, but very distantly based on it. It has no operatic elements in it as such, for a feature called Four Moods, which was made by 4 different directors, one of them Li Hanxiang himself, as a sort of benefit project to try and raise money to save Grand from bankruptcy. In this enterprise it failed, and both Li Hanxiang and King Hu returned to Hong Kong around 1971. It's around that time that King Hu acted in a little-known film directed by Burgess Meredith in Hong Kong, known as The Yin and the Yang of Mr. Go, a very bizarre film. It happens to also be the first film featuring a young actor called Jeffrey Bridges, along with Burgess Meredith and others himself. Anyhow, let's not go there. You can find that on YouTube, incidentally, if you're curious to see it. Li Hanxiang rejoined Shaw Brothers and started the films of the second phase of his career with the company, which became increasingly scriptless and increasingly frivolous, less and less ambitious as he went along. King declined to rejoin Shaw Brothers, and instead looked to Golden Harvest, who financed 2 films. He started his own company. This had become the norm after Bruce Lee, who'd done the same with Raymond Chow, the boss of Golden Harvest. And King, following that example, started King Hu Film Productions and went to Raymond Chow and got financing to make 2 films. And the deal was that the copyright for the first one, The Fate of Li Khan, would remain with Golden Harvest, and the copyright for the second one, The Valiant Ones, would return to King, or would remain with King himself and his own company as one of his company assets. So these two films were made. After that, King continued trying to work in Hong Kong as an independent producer, and at the end of the 1970s, he made two films back to back on location in Korea, both of them historical dramas. The first one, a martial arts film set in the Ming Dynasty called Raining in the Mountain, and the other set much older, much further back in history in the Sung Dynasty, a kind of ghost story called Legend of the Mountain. These films were not especially successful. They seemed, I think, rather old-fashioned, in fact, by the currents of the times in the late 70s. It was also the time when Hong Kong was beginning to see its new wave develop. So King was, I think, a little bit left behind by this. And his subsequent work was a bit disappointing, it has to be said. I think Raining of the Mountains is his last major film, probably. Raining in the Mountain is probably his last major work, but he did carry on filmmaking as much as he could in the following decade. He'd married in the late 70s a woman called Chung Ling, a Chinese scholar, who scripted Legend of the Mountain. And with and without her help, in the 1980s, he went on to make a film called All the King's Men, a historical spectacle shot in Taiwan for a small Taiwan company, actually a subsidiary of the government's film company. He made more in Hong Kong. Actually, again, friends came together on a benefit project for him to try and help him retrieve his company. That was called The Juvenizer, and was a modern comedy that didn't work out very well. And right at the end of his life, or his life in the Far East anyway, he made a film in China for the first time on location called Painted Skin, another ghost story, again allegedly based on a story by Pu Song Ling from Strange Tales from a Chinese Studio. However, he decamped with his wife to California, lived in Pasadena, and devoted himself in the last years of his life to trying to set up a long-cherished project about the Chinese who went to California in the 19th century to build the railroad, the Pacific Railroad. This was a film called I Go, Oh No, which went through many different screenplay drafts and many possible sources of financing. John Woo and his producer Terence Chang at one stage stepped in to try and co-finance it, and they raised about half the money necessary for it. But it was never to happen, and there was never a definitive script either, because it went through so many different drafts and so many different hands. It was, however, a kind of 19th century American remake of Touch of Zen. It even had a rerun of the haunted fort sequence where a small number of defenders managed to convince a large number of attackers that they are far more than they actually are by arraying a whole set of tricks and feints and devices to try and persuade the attackers that they're facing a much bigger defense force than in fact is the case. Anyhow, this film never did get made, and King sadly died in Pasadena in 1997, just before the handover of Hong Kong back to China.
看你愿意不愿意。
请咱们一厢情愿也不行啊。
瞧你说的，他们家穷的连饭都吃不上，嫁给咱们还不愿意呀？准行！明儿一早我就跟他妈去说去。哟，早点回来听回信儿。
哎。娘，
哎呦，吓我一跳！你怎么还没走啊？
哎，怎么样了？
不行。哎，你上哪儿去啊？
我上铺子。
眼看就下雨了，今儿甭去了。
哎，娘，他妈怎么说？
他妈糊里糊涂的，倒想他早点嫁，他自己不愿意。
为什么？
他说什么有难言之隐，我看呢，还不是嫌咱们家穷。你要有个功名就不同了。
娘，你又来了。
今年就去给我考乡试。
娘，我不是跟您说过吗？
说什么？你现在要是有个一官半职，今天也不会碰钉子了。
娘，
你要是老卖话，这辈子也甭打算娶媳妇了。
娘，你
冒昧的很，刚才叫门没人应，我就推门进来了。
啊，失迎失迎，这是欧阳公子。 这是家母。哎，您请坐。
太夫人，
坐呀。我们这里乱七八糟的，您可别见笑啊。
哪里哪里，事呀何须大，
还大呢。
知道幽静的。
坐。
顾兄
啊，
今天怎么没到市上？
嗨，别提
家里有
了。
点事。
今天早起来，我到你铺子去过了。
抱歉，您的像画
没了，
画的不成样子，请多指教。
太好了，太好了，
过奖。
以顾兄的才华隐居此地，未免太可惜了吧？
唉，山野村夫哪还会有什么非分的妄想？
不知道今年的乡试，顾兄去不去应？
好，
您看他那俩瞎子还成吗？
好。
娘，
以公子的才华，万无不中之理。
哪里？
你看是不是？今年你就去考。
顾兄要是有意仕途的话，有些地方我倒可以效劳。
不必麻烦了。
您那有熟人呐，那可真是太好了。
一定遵命。
好，您的意思我心领了。今年我不打算去考乡试。
您别听他的，这事儿全照您了。
娘，
你少说话。
顾兄不妨再想想看，随时吩咐我一声就是。
不用了。
娘不成敬意。
公子，画的不成样子，就算我送给你。
那怎么成呢？
再说也用不了这么多嘛，定名每张5000银子。
哎呀，别退来退去的了，这位公子又不是外人，省得你就收下吧。
公子，
太夫人，我跟您告辞了，
您就收下吧，
改天再来看您。
娘你，公子，您的画像要不要提个款啊？好，
提好了给带到铺子里。下去了，
有空请过来坐啊。这位欧阳公子人不错，你应该跟他多联络联络。
站住！
哪位？谁呀？
石将军。
谁呀？救命啊！
哟，赞美先生。
石先生。哎呦！
哟，怎么了？
真不轻啊！不要紧，太滑了。
你瞧瞧，一脸的血。
我的马杆呢？你甭管马杆了，快躲雨啊！我的马杆呢？我的马杆，我的马杆呢？
哟，脑袋开了。
我马杆呢？
是吗？我去找刀上药去。
我的马杆呢？待会儿给你找去。好，杨小姐，您瞧瞧。 外边受了风寒，内有湿热，不要紧的。
可不是嘛！昨天晚上出来抬那个虾子，正赶上下着大雨，轮得我就跟水鸭子似的，一连打了几个冷战。我就知道，不对了。
娘，鲁大夫给您开副药，吃了就好了。
你懂什么？
老太太
啊？
这副药吃2煎，多发点汗，不要紧的，您放心吧。
啊，走吧。
这诊费，
慢慢再说吧。
不，还是
好了，一块儿算嘛。自己人忙什么？是不是？
娘，到铺子里歇会儿。
歇什么？回家去。
回家。
好，回见您。
杨小姐，你不认识我了？站住！我请问你一件事情：这街上有个算命的瞎子，你认识不认识他？您歇会儿。
都到家了，歇什么？杨姑娘，你辛苦了。哟，你脸怎么了？
您好点了吧？
老了，不成了。你瞧瞧这大包药。
杨小姐，你要是累的话，你先回去休息一会儿。那个算命的石先生，你以前认不认识啊？
不认识。
姑娘，真难为你了，一夜还没有睡吧？累不累呀？
我们不是更穷？
也难怪，你们娘俩怕嫁过来跟我们一块儿受罪。
伯母，您睡会儿吧。
都是省寨不上进，他连个乡试都不去考。
公子一定有他的道理。
他净是歪理，就跟我死了的老头子一样，念了一辈子书，就是不肯做官。现在落得，唉。
公子对您那么孝顺，也是您的福气。
孝顺有什么用啊？到现在连个媳妇儿都没混上。
以公子的才华，将来一定能娶个名门闺秀。
唉，我倒不指望娶什么名门闺秀。他30多了，我又病病歪歪的。那天我一闭眼，我们顾家的香烟就算断了。
罗大夫，那天的诊费是……
慢慢再说吧。
不，
忙什么呢？就收你药钱了，一共是1吊半。
好。
令堂的病好点了吧？
好多了，谢谢您。这几天街上来了不少东厂的贩子。
听说他们的二头目门达要来。
哦，回见。卢大夫，您认不认识一个欧阳年的？
欧阳年？不认识。
好，回见啊。
回见。爷爷，他怎么？
顾公子，今天晚上到我那里去一趟。
Well, we're back with some commentary now, just after the sex scene. If we call it a sex scene, that's of course a slightly sardonic way of describing it, since it couldn't be more decorous, but it's a lot less decorous than the original story, in which Ms. Yang refuses to go to bed with Gu and refuses to perpetuate his family line, the Gu family, to give him an heir, which turns out to be one of the strands of plot that runs through A Touch of Zen. King Hu now has us exploring once again the outdoor standing set of the Jinglu fort, heavily overgrown, as we can now see in daylight. The shift to daylight is, I think, important because every time the film shifts from night to day, it connotes somehow a shift in the frame of reference of the film. Broadly, it connotes a shift from the Taoist thrust of many scenes to the Buddhist thrust of other scenes. But it also has a more poetic resonance, I think, in that it takes us from the minutiae of Mr. Gu's rather straitened domestic circumstances to the larger intrigue of the political thriller, which is what dominates the middle hour of the film. Actually, the whole rest of the film, in a way, although once Buddhism takes centre stage, the politics is rather pushed into second place. Now, Ouyang Nian's arrival in the fort, heralded by the sinister shadow and a view from behind, again is rather Leone-esque, I think. It once again betrays the influence of the Italian Western, which was pretty pervasive across East Asia in the late 60s. But it heralds, in this case, as he bursts in on, the marital bedroom, or the quasi-marital bedroom, a refiguring of the protagonists. Suddenly, Gu is literally pushed aside, as we just saw, and the confrontation between two antagonists takes centre stage, and this, of course, leads to the first fight scene in the film. We remind ourselves that this is billed as a martial arts film, and we're now getting on for 1 hour into it, and this is the first time that swords have been drawn and that real violence is beginning to occur. However, it's presented, as we note, in an extremely dreamlike way from the perspective of Gu. There are constant cutbacks to Gu watching this, especially as the antagonists retreat further and further away. They leap onto rooftops, they leap onto the entry gate to the fort, they leap down from the gate and disappear somehow into the distance. Now, this is old-style martial arts play. It depends obviously on the trampoline. You can see hidden trampolines play an important part in staging of this scene. And there's no wire work as such. The whole tradition of martial arts choreography had been revitalized in Hong Kong. Actually, it was born in Hong Kong by the shooting of a Robert Wise film, which shot both in Taiwan and in Hong Kong, called The Sand Pebbles in the earlier 60s. They had brought with them, Robert Wise's crew and Universal Studios had brought with them a lot of special effects specialists and stunt people, and they trained an entire generation of Hong Kong and Taiwan film personnel how to do stunts. So what had previously been a rather limited area of activity with a limited range of special effects enhancing it, turned into a major industry. And it was pretty much a direct result of the appearance of the Sand Pebbles on location in Hong Kong. King Hu was somewhat resistant to this. He worked with a martial arts choreographer called Han Yingjie, who you will see later in the film as one of the actors. He's the chief baddie at the very end of the film, Xu, the man who stabs the abbot at the end. He's one of the two main martial arts choreographers of the film. But King Hu chose to take his choreography not so much from the martial traditions of China, which are considerable, but more from the acrobatic stagecraft of Peking opera, which was something much more stylized, no less physically skilled perhaps in its way, but much less inherently violent. It was more designed to symbolize violence than to be violent as such. So he was the antithesis, if you like, of a director like Zhang Che, working at the same time in Shaw Brothers, who went more and more for blood and guts as the late 60s, early 70s wore on. Now, you also note that King's cutting style, he's credited incidentally as the editor of the film himself. King's cutting style, as well as the shooting style, is quite rapid for much of the film, except when he looks at the protagonist Gu. And this scene, in which Gu is overwhelmed by the pursuit, by what he's seen, and by the sun, of course directly prefigures the end of the film. In fact, the music rather underlines that point. I think we should say just a little bit more about Bu Song Ling and the original story at this point. So I'll stop being scene specific and talk a bit more generally about what was in King's head when he started to put this film together. He himself wrote about Bu Song Ling and strange stories from a Chinese studio. When he produced a note on the film for the Cannes press kit when it was shown there in 1975. He said, I'm quoting this, "In my student days, Liao Jai was one of my favourite books. Its bizarre tales of ghosts and fox spirits held me spellbound for days on end. Indirectly, reading the book also helped me to acquire an abundance of exotic words and phrases." Well, the book was written by Bu Song Ling, who was born only 4 years before the end of the Ming dynasty. He is technically a Ming writer, but he didn't start writing until well into the Qing dynasty, the following dynasty, the Manchu dynasty. King, however, was particularly entranced by the Ming dynasty. He thought that this was the most interesting period of China's modern history. And he made a number of films set in the Ming dynasty, and he particularly liked the style, the culture, the whole ambience of Ming China. And so this story is set in the Ming dynasty. It makes political references. The political background of the story is quite accurate and specific to the Ming. The original story, however, by Bu Song Ling is left very general, but we can assume that it was set in the Ming dynasty or possibly earlier, but it doesn't give a particular historical frame of reference because it's a kind of fairy tale. It's a fox spirit story, the original. It is very brief, less than 3 pages in modern reprints, and it comes, as we said, from this book Liao Jai Zhi, which is the source book for most Chinese stories of ghosts, spirits, hauntings. It paves the way for pretty much the entire Chinese horror tradition, the bits of it that are not imported from the West anyway. In the original story, we have the situation of an impoverished rural scholar living with his mother, not marrying, not taking the civil service exam to advance his career, content to earn or scrape a living working as a calligrapher and painter in a small country town. A woman moves into an abandoned house opposite their home. His mother immediately thinks that she might make a suitable bride. She could, if she were to marry him, the family line could be perpetuated because she could have children. Everything would be much better, and also this might encourage him to advance his career by actually doing the civil service exam. None of this happens, however, because although he befriends the woman, or the mother particularly gets on well with the woman, he becomes very friendly with a man who comes and asks for his portrait to be painted and who looks rather lustfully at the woman. But on one occasion, after a number of meetings, the woman attacks the man or lunges at him. He flees. She throws a dagger, and what falls to the ground is a silver fox, a white fox, its head severed from its body. And she points out that this friend, so-called friend, was in fact a fox spirit. She then disappears, and that's it. That's the whole of the original story. As you can see, the film takes various elements from this, including some characters. However, it in no way follows the story, and the story contains no hint of either the political framework, the story of a revenge attack from the Ming court, or a eunuch called Wei in the Ming court, pursuing his enemies across China, or the Buddhist element, the touch of Zen that King was concerned to introduce into the story, despite its Taoist origins. Well, I should say that the Ming Dynasty ended in 1644 in the Western calendar. Pu Songling was born only 4 years before that, in 1640, so he lived principally in the Qing dynasty, the following dynasty. China was invaded. The Ming had become very weak by this point. China was invaded by Manchus from Manchuria. They founded the Qing dynasty, which was the last great dynasty in China, overthrown in the 1911 revolution, which founded the first Republic of China, and then itself overthrown by the 1949 revolution, which founded the People's Republic of China. So there you have modern Chinese history in a nutshell. Liao Jai Zhi, Strange Stories from a Chinese Studio, was completed, we know, by the author's own account, in 1679. So this is sort of Milton period, if we are looking for Western points of comparison or reference. It was first printed sometime after Pu Songling's death in 1740, and it was first published in a accessible, available edition by a man called Tan Ming Lun, not until 1842, so a full century later. But it became the source material for, as we've said, nearly all famous Chinese ghost stories. For example, Choi Hak's famous A Chinese Ghost Story, it's a production by Choi Hak, directed by Tony Ching, is based on a story by Pu Songling. And it was a story first filmed by Li Hanxiang, whom we've referred to before as King Hu's friend and mentor. He made it for Shaw Brothers in 1958 under the title Enchanting Shadow. The same story, and actually Tony Ching and Choi Hak's remake is surprisingly close to the Li Hanxiang original, if you look at it. Anyway, that was a good example, a typical example of a story from Pu Songling tricked out into a film, a feature-length film. There are many, many others. Now, this one, in order to adapt the film, this very short story into a film, King has added very many other elements, particularly the political machinations in the background, and of course the Buddhist framework that makes the film about a touch of Zen.
犯不着和他们瞎混，他们都是亡命之徒。
哎，走，快走！不要紧。小姐，你怎么还不走啊？
我有事情没办完呢。
现在刑部各地贴着告示在抓你，东厂的人又跟踪到这里，那么你打算怎么办呢？
我总不能坐以待毙就是了。
那么小姐要跟那班人周旋到底了。
公子，快走吧。
小姐的事，我不能袖手旁观。
为什么？
我跟小姐情同夫妻，应该有难同当。
你我孽缘已尽，不必提那些个。
哎，就算是朋友吧，我也要助小姐一臂之力。
哼，这种拼命的事，公子恐怕力不从心吧？
拼命是匹夫之勇，有勇无谋，难成大事。
那么公子另有高见了？
哎，以寡敌众，只宜智取，不能力夺。 小姐要是信任我的话，我愿意效犬马之劳。
我现在身陷绝境，有人肯帮忙，哪有不信任的道理？
好，那你……
我只是不愿意把公子牵连在内。
不必谈这些了，请小姐原原本本把事情告诉我。知彼知己，百战百胜。哎，平安。不要跟这班鼠辈们计较。哎，前天我给圣上上了一个奏折，里边全是根据各位查访所得，例举了魏延的24条大罪和东厂之种种不法行径。这是抄本，你们把它给带回去，给东林的朋友传阅一下。恐怕皇上看不到大人的奏折，那我就面奏。是。奏折要是落在魏延的手里，那就麻烦了。总之，我要跟这班人周旋到底。
大人，回禀大人，传旨太监带着东厂的人来了。
啊，正卿，预备接旨。是。
内下，杨大人接旨。
是。
从简吧。
是。
圣旨下，跪听宣读。
万岁。
奉天承运，皇帝诏曰：宣杨连饥客进宫觐见，钦此。
万万岁。 雄名毕，克扣了200万两军饷，有没有这回事啊？啊，真是笑话！要说我杨某人贪赃，恐怕普天下的人都不会相信。你不招，你们矫诏把我骗到这儿来，我要面奏圣上。用刑。
家父受尽了飞行拷打，让他们给折磨死了。石文桥不定安2位将军，就带着我逃出了京城。
哦，就是石先生和鲁大夫。
魏忠贤并没有善罢甘休，在各地密布了东厂的番子来抓我。2位将军就带着我一路逃到汴塞。
在这儿不敢胡来。
哎，刚才过去3个人看见没有？
还没有圆寂的时候，
哎，
府门。
我跟你说话。这是怎么回事？
哦，刚才施主的部下持强行凶，多亏贫僧及时制止，那几个人才免于大难。是。
你是个出家人，就应该在庙里参禅悟道，不要管这些世间的俗物。
佛门净地哪有杀人的道理？
法师，留着这些孽障，将来后患无穷。
施主旅途劳顿，还是请上小刹休息一下吧。请。
慧元师傅学了不少防身之术。现在想不到天下虽大，四海之内已经没有我们立足之地了。
要是慧元师傅肯帮忙，这件事情就好办多了。
师傅不肯帮忙，
那怀远县的徐正清呢？
他是义不容辞。
现在听说门达聂求亲自出马，名为监军，其实就是来抓你们。你打算怎么办？
我想趁其不备，中途截击。
不好，你们应该以逸待劳。
莫测高深。
这是靖洛屯堡的乡土，也就是你们占的地利。你们应当据此守株待兔。我自幼熟读兵书，略知布阵之法。只要你们能诱敌深入，我自有办法瓮中捉鳖。
陆强，什么事啊？
Okay, we're back with some commentary, and by now we have the backstory. We've heard first the official version given in the magistrate's office when Gu was invited to copy wanted posters for Miss Yang, and we've heard subsequently her version, illustrated with flashbacks, which includes, of course, her first encounter with Abbot Hui Yuan, the Buddhist hero of the film, as it were. By this time, Gu has assertively insisted that he become a kind of advisor to them. He has tried to make himself important, and it leads into the second major action set piece of the film, the fight in the bamboo forest, which is coming up. The fight, you will have gathered, is designed to prevent Ouyang Nian from reporting to his superior, or rather the envoys from his superior, Menta. There is, of course, in the Eastern Group, who are the bad guys in this film, the Eastern Group who really existed, the Dongchang, they're known as in Chinese, were a kind of secret police. They were in the service of the court eunuchs, who had usurped a great deal of power to themselves away from the emperor. And the Dongchang, the reason that King Hu focused on the Dongchang, who also appear in his previous film Dragon Gate Inn, is partly, he said, rather amusingly I think it sounds to us now anyway, in response to the popularity of the James Bond films in the 1960s. He thought it was rather reprehensible that somebody was given a license to kill, and that the idea that a secret agent could be somehow above the law was to him a rather anathemous one. So he decided to focus on the Dongchang, the Eastern Group, in these two films, largely because they could be secret agents, as it were, secret police, who could be criticized, who could be shown to be evil, could be shown to be wrong in trying to act above the law, and who needed to be brought to heel. In this case, they're brought to heel not so much by their political enemies, although that does obviously play a part in it, but by a larger philosophy, the touch of Zen that dominates the film. But we'll come back to that at the end of the film, perhaps. Now, this set-piece fight was created by King Hu and shot in Taiwan, in, I think, a real bamboo forest. Very amusing, you know. This was obviously a film like Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon plays elaborate homage to this. Ang Lee, who was also from Taiwan, is extremely respectful of King Hu, and King Hu's films probably are the major source of inspiration, in fact, for Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. And Cheng Pei Pei, who was the evil witch in Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, was the star of King Hu's Come Drink With Me. So there's a direct reference there. But King, I think, was the first person in the genre to shoot in a real bamboo forest, which is a famously difficult place to shoot partly because, as you can see, the trees are rather close together. There's very limited room for maneuverability. And if you try and take longer shots, trees get in the way. It's impossible to avoid having trees in the way unless you cut a lot of them down, which obviously he didn't want to do. So choreographing and staging a scene like this is quite a difficult matter, just because of the density of the bamboo trees. But the fact that they're also enormously tall and very straight gives you compositional challenges and makes it harder to construct a credible space for the fight scene, for the action choreography, than it would be if you had a space that you could control more easily. Now, we started to talk about this earlier, and it's the time, I think, to pick up on it. King Hu always insisted that his interest in working with people like Han Yingjie, his choreographer, was not so much in real martial arts, but more in dance. He took this inspiration from the Peking opera, which has martial scenes, but which are quite stylized. They're stylized in the form of acrobatics. A general conventionally represents an entire platoon with an array of flags on his back to symbolize all the men who are there in spirit but not on the stage. You don't have to do that kind of stylization or symbolism in film, of course. But King always thought of these action scenes, the tumbling, the fainting, fainting F-E-I-N-T-I-N-G, I mean, not fainting as in fainting out in the way that Ku frequently does in the film. The double bluffs, the sword play, the the give and take, and from this point on, the flying, the beginning to sever trees, the leaping to treetops, the shooting down from a treetop, using the natural flexibility of the bamboo as if it were a giant bow to propel the leaper. It's Miss Yang, in fact, in normal cases. So all of that, I think, is more to do with King's sense that this is a kind of dance scene, rather than something that's more to do with macho action as such. Well, you'll notice he credits himself as the editor. He is very much the active editor here. Most of these shots are very brief, and there are virtuoso flurries of editing in which it's still quite possible to follow the movement of the characters, the overall placement of the characters, although the sequence is fragmented into very many short shots. Often with onlookers providing punctuation, as you saw there with Gu and the young boy who was the messenger. Now, I think this entire sequence, but actually the film as a whole, was a masterclass for a director like Tsui Hark in Hong Kong. And when Tsui Hark had his own company, Film Workshop, one of the things he tried to do, in fact, was employ King Hu in the mid-80s to make a film for him. And as we've already noted in our sketchy biography of King Hu, King was somewhat left behind by changing fashions by the 1980s, and the experiment of trying to work with Tsui Hark didn't work out too well. He shot only, I think, 2 or 3 days on a film called Swordsman, based on a very famous martial arts novel. And after the legend has it, the first screening of Rushes, Tsui Hark said, I thought it was going to be funny, and they agreed to part company. So I think only one shot, an establishing landscape shot, I think, survives in the finished film, although King Hu is still credited as director on it. But that was a kind of homage, intended as a homage to King Hu, and it still plays somewhat like that, albeit with a very comic inflection. But what I'm trying to point out is that King's style, particularly the editing style in the action sequences, was a masterclass for a director like Tsui Hark. It taught him how you could fragment action into constituent moments and parts, but maintain continuity. Well, we're now past the bamboo forest fight, but I think it's worth pointing out that genre fans will recall that in Zhang Yimou's first martial arts film, Hero, there was also a fight in a bamboo forest, which is clearly indebted to the one we've just seen. It always amuses me to recall that at the time, Zhang Yimou, who has absolutely no background in martial arts cinema and no specialist knowledge of it, or even a fan knowledge of it, because he grew up in mainland China where martial arts cinema was non-existent for the period of his youth and adolescence. But he obviously saw Touch of Zen at some later point. And in one of the interviews he gave about Hero, he was stressing that, bamboo forest, there are lots of bamboo forest fights in films, so I'm using a genre convention here. What he was clearly ignorant of, and he was showing his ignorance, is the fact that there are very, very few bamboo forest fights in Chinese martial arts cinema because they're so difficult to shoot. He was oblivious to this, but in fact he was indebted to King Hu, but was reluctant to say so. But then Zhang Yimou is a filmmaker who never knowingly says anything positive about any other filmmaker, so I suppose we shouldn't be surprised. Now, the other point to mention here is that this business with Ouyang Nian, who is, I think, about to leave us, or he's getting close to his death at this point, especially when General Lu Anting comes along offering to treat him, and he sees it, of course, as a threat, correctly, probably. What this brings into play is Gu's increasing role as a strategist in this larger campaign to safeguard Ms. Yang and her two loyal generals. Gu is an educated man, as we've said, educated above his station in life as a calligrapher and painter in a small rural town. But somebody who is not ambitious enough to want to take the imperial exam or too protective of his mother in her old age, wanting to stay with her and look after her, to actually pursue a marriage of his own and do anything about furthering the Gu family line. Well, he makes himself useful here to the rebels or the runaways by presenting himself as a strategist. And the film is very methodical in presenting the way that he develops his strategies. He is the one who comes up with the idea of making the fort haunted, putting up an array of tricks, mechanical devices, bells, and who knows what else, automatic arrow firers, to make it seem that there are far more people in the fort than in fact is the case. And he roots all of that in his earlier discovery that Ms. Yang, when she moved in, had tricked up her room, the room she commandeered in the place, with bells and other alarms that would signal an intruder, that would give her early warning of an intruder. The very things that made him think it was haunted in the first place, and which he discovered in daylight, were precisely mechanical alarms. Things that were hung up and tripwires and such, designed to make noises that would protect the fugitives. The reason we stress this is because strategy becomes a key thing for King Hu. His later films, particularly the films of the 70s, are also masterclasses in strategy. Not a fighter himself, not at all a martial man by physique or temperament. Nonetheless, in Dragon Gate Inn, he is at pains to show how the villainous eunuch, also the head of the Eastern group, the Dongchang, is overcome by a team, a coalition of others who have to work in harmony with each other and develop a group strategy for overcoming him because he is too powerful to deal with otherwise. In this case, something similar is obtaining. It's necessary for these runaways, the rebels, to find ways to overcome the Eastern group, and the only way they're going to do it, because there are so few of them, is through strategy that will defend their position and make them seem stronger than in fact they are. In subsequent films, The Fate of Li Khan, for example, in which a group of people have to stage an ambush at an inn and they pose as its staff. And in the valiant ones, in which Japanese pirates marauding on the southern coast of China have to be defeated in the Ming Dynasty. All of these films are very much focused on strategy, and King uses a number of metaphors, including the game of Go, like Chinese-Japanese chess, where with black and white pieces are made to fill up a board. Things like that are offered as examples of strategy that power the plots and explain why the heroes prevail, assuming they do prevail. In fact, in all King Hu films, heroes do prevail, but often at great cost. There are frequently losses, deaths along the way. Well, we'll see in this film. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. Anyhow, hence the emphasis on strategy, and hence the fact that an ordinary man, an unambitious man in the normal course of things, becomes central to the lives of people who are much more ambitious, much more highborn, much more powerful than he will ever be. But he makes himself useful to them by becoming their strategist.
参见指挥。找到欧阳年没有？还没有。那么镇远将军府你去过了没有？怎么？回指挥，听说那个地方屡经兵灾战祸，已经荒芜不堪了。哦，那你先去收拾一下。回指挥，听说那个地方不大干净。什么不干净？听说，是有鬼魅出现。切，什么都是听说。不要听信那些无稽之谈。明天你就去。是。留几个人在外边。是，你们4个守在外边。是。里边。 有这种事吗？回指挥，这是卑职亲眼看到的。哼，妖魔鬼怪的事情，我倒听说过不少，就是没见过。我倒想见识见识。李指挥身系边疆安危之重任，似乎未便冒险前往。鬼神不会来找我们。你没听说过神鬼怕恶人吗？
这
不要信这一套，也许是一般无知的渔民以讹传讹，造谣生事。可是下边的人都深信不疑呀。哦，我想这背后大概有奸人捣乱吧。县太爷，你说对不对？
是，大人明察。
可是他不信啊。他不信这一套，听他的口气，好像对我们太爷起了疑心了。
我看呢也不必费事了，干脆咱们几个人晚上进县衙门摆那几个小子。
哎，那就前功尽弃了。
我想，最好能让他们后天晚上来。
师爷，明天给门达送份礼去。
啊，欧阳年。黄眼线，
在
这欧阳年的尸首，你是在哪儿找到的？
在净罗屯堡附近。
欧阳千户死在你的境内，显然是被人谋杀的。你还有什么话说？
下官知罪。
好极了！来人呐，
在，
把他押下去，听候发落。
大人，下官另有内情禀告二位大人。
说吧。
事关机密，能不能请他们？
说吧。杨慧珍，是不是杨莲的女儿？
是，还有2个弃官逃走的将军呢。
好极了，他们3个都在这儿。还有什么人？
听说他们3个人正意味召集各地的山贼草寇，图谋不轨，进城来劫持二位大人。
哦，先下手为强。指挥，卑职今天晚上就带人把他们一网打尽。
什么事儿这么慌张？
副指挥啊，真有
埋伏，
有鬼啊！
是有鬼啊！
他们两个说完了。
大人，果然像传闻所说，慌呢，你小心提防埋伏。是。什么事？副指挥，你看。大人，我看不如告诉他们不要乱。是。不要乱！副指挥，你还是和大人商量商量吧。
这人不能跟鬼斗啊！
我看还是明天白天再来吧。再说干咱们这行呢，平时造孽多，杀气重。大人，我看，切，你平时极为机警，怎么能看不出这是奸人的诡计呢？
是，不过。卑职想这是除怒鬼神。
哎，你身负重任，怎么能相信这些鬼神的邪说呢？
是，卑职刚才跟几个头目商量下来，
你们要造反呐！不要乱，保护大别让他跑了。史文桥， 大人，他们一定在里边。留神！大人，我在这儿守着，你们俩分头去找。杨小姐，饶命！
妇人之仁，足以贻误大事。
Well, back to commentary, and we noted earlier in this commentary that every transition from night to day in this film has a larger resonance. Broadly, it signals a shift from a Taoist frame of reference, the night, the moon, the suspicion of ghosts and hauntings and such, to the day, which brings clarity, revelation, and ultimately, through the personification of the sun, the touch of Zen, the particular strand of esoteric Buddhism that the film is concerned to show as all-powerful, more powerful than the political machinations of the emperor's court and its evil agents. Well, that's true in this sequence, but it's also more narrowly true in that what we're seeing here, of course, is Gu exulting in the mechanical inventions of various sorts, the dummies, the models, the puppets, the catapults, the arrows, the bows designed to fire many arrows and such like, all the tricks that he came up with as part of his strategy to convince the marauding hordes of Last Night that there were a lot of defenders in this fort, and also that the fort was haunted. A part of that, of course, was the psychological warfare, which gave us that multi-screen shot of gossip being spread. That's also a fashion of the 1960s, I guess. I seem to remember that the Thomas Crown Affair was the first film that made extensive use of multi-screen, but there were, of course, quite a few others, including more Steve McQueen films even. Anyhow, King uses multi-screen only that one time, that one shot, in order to dramatise the spread of gossip, the notion that the Jinglu fort is once again heavily haunted, designed to spread fear and panic in the minds of the foot soldiers of the Dongchang, the Eastern group. And of course it's effective. It has terrorised them and terrified them and made them jumpy and vulnerable to the kind of attack that these few defenders are able to mount. Of course, this demonstration is kind of like a conjurer first wowing us with some illusion on a big scale on the stage, and then afterwards showing us how it was all done. It's precisely like that, but it heralds this shift in tone in the sequence. You will recall that the second villain from the Eastern group, Menta, played by Wang Rei, 2 out of 4 we're going to see in the course of the film, a kind of hierarchy, an ascending hierarchy of villains. He was slaughtered in front of a fake funeral tablet for Yang Huichen's father, Yang Lian. Yang Lian was persecuted to death by Eunuch Wei, as we saw in a flashback. This fake funeral tablet has been set up there in order to convince them that it's his spirit that is somehow haunting the fort and seeking revenge on them. And it's in front of this tablet that Menta has been slaughtered, spraying his blood, in fact, across the tablet, as it were. But it's stumbling on his corpse, literally stumbling on his corpse, that brings Gu the realization that he's in fact surrounded by corpses. Now, this brings home to us, the viewer, that all of these corpses not previously seen in the sequence were in fact there all along. It's just that his perception is what has shifted. It's not our apprehension of what's been going on here or what the result has been. So we're seeing pretty explicitly through Gu's eyes here. We saw, just as we saw the haunting or the fake haunting through his eyes, we saw the revelation of the tricks behind the illusions through his eyes, and now we see the fact of death through his eyes. And what the only thing that can trump this is what does indeed trump this now, which is the arrival of the Buddhist monks. Gu becomes increasingly distraught, I think it's fair to say, at the carnage that his devices have helped to wreak. But it's the Buddhists who turn up now in order to bury the corpses, to clean up, to make good. And it's their arrival that brings home to Gu that he's in fact now alone, that the people he was helping have in fact gone away. Now, I think the rest of this is completely self-explanatory in narrative terms. I don't need to clarify anything here. But it is worth saying that there had been no martial arts film, either old style or new style, that had done anything like this before. So King Hu is very ambitiously advancing the genre here. It's not only the scale of the action, the fact that he felt able to make a 3-hour film with all of these different frames of reference, that you start with something like everyday life in a small rural town in the Ming Dynasty, you move on to the political intrigues of the court and their ramifications, and then you move on to the larger spiritual realities of Buddhism, and in particular esoteric Zen Buddhism, and the power that it might have in order to regulate human lives, including the machinations of the court, which need to be cut down to size and shown to be the small, insignificant things, the transient, worthless things that in fact they are. We'll come back to this in the closing scene of the film, which will be our last bit of commentary. But I'd just like to note that this kind of thinking was unique in the genre. I mean, it builds clearly on what King Hu had done in Dragon Gate Inn, but nobody else really was making films on this scale or with this level of philosophical stroke political ambition. And just as we could say that the machinations of the Eastern group, the Dongchang, as seen first in Dragon Gate Inn, but also seen in this film, contain some distant echo of what was going on in China at the time. This is the time, remember, of the Cultural Revolution in China. Hard to get concrete news out of China, but King Hu, like others based in Hong Kong and Taiwan, is subject to a steady barrage of leaks coming out of China, information passed on by people who fled, refugees who arrived in Hong Kong and Taiwan, with news that kids are running wild, that there's anarchy on the streets, that law and order has completely broken down, that people are killing with impunity, that all authority figures are being challenged and toppled, usually by their ignorant juniors, and that central control seems to have become hopelessly corrupt. Well, obviously what goes on with the Eastern group is not an exact analogue for what went on in China in the early years of the Cultural Revolution. But I think the anarchy, the fearsome tales of anarchy that were coming out of China in the late 60s, as people heard about friends being persecuted to death, about authority figures being challenged, about people running wild, about crimes not being punished, does feed into these films that King Hu made. Although they're not direct political commentaries on the present in China, they carry resonances which are very relevant to the situation in China, albeit one that was understood only in a very limited way at the time. Now, needless to say, this kind of resonance is also pretty rare in the martial arts film at this point. When the new wave directors in Hong Kong move into action at the end of the 1970s, the beginning of the 1980s, particularly Choi Hak, who is the only one of them who specializes in martial arts films and makes them quite often, then it becomes far more routine or regular to imbue the stories with direct sense of political allegory. The fact that the films are confected stories that more or less explicitly comment on the present day or times closer to our own. It was not the norm in the late 1960s, although it had been arguably in Chinese drama much earlier. King Hu didn't come up with this idea completely fresh. He is an educated scholar and a very well-read man, but he is here applying lessons that he learnt from his other learning into martial arts cinema, where it had not really found a home before.
杨素贞，你的夙缘未尽，将来我要能成正果，再来度你。现在顾省斋远了，你随石将军去吧。
石将军、杨小姐，新授锦衣卫北镇抚司徐显纯参见石将军。
不敢。
下官奉了魏公之命，请二位回京共商大计。
请你回复魏忠贤，杨小姐和我石某人现在逃光阳回，无意回京和他共商大计。
要说是请二位回京销案，也未尝不可。
哼，这件事我就更爱难从命。
好，那我就帮不上忙了。二位还是要再好好的想一想。
Right, we're back for the final section of this intermittent commentary, and we're at the climax of the film. We have here the leader of the Eastern Group. He's not Eunuch Wei himself, but the top agent working for the Dongchang, or the Eastern Group, under the eunuchs, played, as we noted earlier, by Han Ying-jie, who is one of the film's action choreographers. He, in fact, worked with King on a number of films, and he appears rather movingly and rather beautifully. In fact, he gets one of his best screen acting roles in Fate of Li Khan, which is King's next feature after this. He's probably best known to Westerners, though, as the big boss, the villainous boss of a Thai ice factory in the Bruce Lee film of that name. He, of course, appears in many Hong Kong martial arts films of the 60s and 70s, which was his heyday. And he was personally trained in Peking opera techniques, and so he was very well placed to give King the kind of dance-style choreography of action that he was looking for. Now, this, of course, the confrontation of the Eastern Group with the monks from this monastery is the high point of the film. It's the confrontation that everything has moved towards. And although you may have noticed just now one fleeting shot in which the kind of white grass is seen in Jinglu Fort was present in the corner of the screen, I think designed as a deliberate visual reminder that we're in the same universe as that, but we've moved up another level. This is a higher plane, if you like, of the conflict that was acted out in the supposedly haunted fort. Abbot Hui Yuan, who is seen as not only a very holy man, but also a very powerful man, all-seeing in many ways, not far off Buddhahood himself, and certainly close to transcendent enlightenment, which he will in fact achieve at the very end of the film, at least symbolically, is played by an actor called Roy Chow, Chow Hong in Chinese. Roy Chow had been a matinee idol in Hong Kong films from the late 50s onwards, in fact, and he was in quite a lot of films of the 60s. Playing conventional modern men, husbands, lovers, that kind of person. King was, I think, the first one to cast him in a role like this, to bring out his inherent, can we call it saintliness? He was in real life a rather profoundly believing Christian. He was also very fluent in English, and he appears in quite a number of Hollywood films shot in Hong Kong, as well as in lots of Hong Kong films, and was, as it happens, a close neighbour of King Hu's at his last address in Hong Kong before he decamped to Pasadena. Lived in the New Territories, just outside Sa Tin. He does have, I think, a commanding presence, which is, of course, what the role requires. And his confrontation with the Eastern Group, particularly Mr. Xu, the leader of it, we have moved up the hierarchy. We've seen he's the fourth of the Eastern Group leaders that we've witnessed in the film, and the most powerful, because in the notion of these hierarchies, each level is more powerful than the one below. And he has met his match, it seems, in Hui Yuan, in that he is now confronting a power beyond the kind of mortal power, the martial power that he is fully at his command. And he's capable of humiliating these junior monks, overturning them, causing them to fall, to fly through the air, to haul them at the other end of the ropes. But he will be overcome by them. He will be harnessed and contained by them. It won't stop him from lunging at Hui Yuan. But he is a kind of evil incarnate. He does still have, as the cutaway just reminded us, two acolytes to call on. And he's still capable of these quasi-magical feats to mount attacks. The escalation, though, of fighting here is, I think, very deliberately into a fantasy realm. The film no longer is interested really in the realities of swordplay and the tactics, the kind of strategies that dominated earlier scenes, particularly when Gu was trying to develop strategies, but also in the way that General Shi, General Lu, and Miss Yang defended themselves against earlier emissaries from the Eastern Group. All of that, even though it contained some fantastical leaping and such, was essentially realistic choreography. Here, particularly with things like the breaking of the blades, snapping of the blades as if they were twigs, we have something altogether more fantastical. This is power games, a power struggle raised to a higher level, a higher plane, if you like. And the notion here is that whatever is going on cannot be reduced to the simple level of a martial arts set to in the way that perhaps earlier parts of the film could. However, if we think back to Dragon Gate Inn, King's enormously successful preceding film, and it was, I stress again, the enormous success of that film that enabled this film to be undertaken, because nobody, I think, at that time in Taiwan cinema would have even contemplated financing a film on the scale of this one and with the production duration of this one if it wasn't coming on the back of an enormous success. This film sets out to redefine the notions of martial artistry in a way that deliberately tries to transcend the genre. So tricks like Xu using his studded belt as the final weapon here is very typical of martial arts cinema. There are plenty of Mandarin martial arts films that have devices or scenes like this in them. But they don't put them in the context of a battle with an omniscient and all-powerful monk. And that's the element, it's the Buddhist element, the touch of Zen, if you like, that raises this above the generic level. I think we should also note at this point that this is when the film really goes into colour. You may have noticed that throughout the first 2 hours of the film, quite apart from the fact that quite a bit of it is set at night, the colour palette has been really drained of bright colours. It's only in this final confrontation, partly because of the unchanging colour of the Buddhist robes, but also because of the successive layers of clothing that we're discovering on Mr. Xu here. Every time he takes off another layer, we find another range of colours. And it brings, I mean, not just his red trousers, but everything about him, the various robes and wrappings and such that he carries about his person. So it's as if the film has suddenly come into colour, full colour as it were, for these climactic scenes in a way that it wasn't before. And this is of course related also to the fact that every time Huiyuan, the Buddhist abbot, appears, the sun is behind him, that he somehow comes with the force of the sun behind him, so that when he and his 4 acolytes effectively floated into this forest clearing from the rock on which they were standing when first glimpsed, it's as if the sun is somehow propelling them. They have a kind of magical force and energy which is beyond human comprehension, beyond human reason. I think this is perhaps the moment we should quote another little bit from King Hu's statement. This is something that he wrote for the press kit of the film when it was premiered in Cannes in 1975. He's talking about he's talking about the challenge of introducing the Buddhist element into the film, into a film founded notionally at least on a Taoist story. Buddhism and Taoism being, happy to coexist in real life in Chinese philosophical systems right alongside Confucianism, which is more a philosophical system than a religious one, but often taken as quasi-religious. These are all belief systems in China that somehow coexist, and many people could claim to be adherents of more than one of them at the same time. But the overall shift in this film, as we've noted, is from Taoist origins and the whole notion of superstition natural-based powers to something more spiritual and transcendental, which is what the Buddhism represents. And anyway, what King wrote in 1975 was that he turned for advice to a devout Buddhist who explained that Zen was something that could not be explained but only felt. And that is to say, through what the Chinese call wu, or awakening to the truth. King comments, nowadays many books on Zen in both Chinese and Western languages seek to explicate it through Western philosophical concepts. So these attempts are bound to result in confusion. The only way to wu, or awakening to the truth, is through yu, which means example or analogy. He points out that is why there is a Buddhist scripture known as the Bai Yu Qing, the 100 Analogy Sutra. Wu is not subject to logical analysis. For example, it must be very difficult to explain the concept of sweet to someone who has never tasted sugar. But enlightenment will come the instant you feed that person a piece of candy. Wu is somewhat akin to this process. At this point, I must stress, however, that I am not a Buddhist myself, and I do not attempt to be a didactic or missionary in my approach. All I'm interested in is to present the flavour of an experience. Now, this final confrontation on the road, again, King has taken most colour out of the background. We're in a rocky area and a sandy area, which is more or less devoid of colour. It's a sort of neutral, off-white colour of the rocks and the sand. And it's only the colour of the costumes that stands out in this setting, and perhaps the blue sky. This is, well, you will recall, as Hui Yuan speaks to the apparently penitent Xu, that he said something to him when he left him in the forest. He left him tied up in the forest. He whispered, and we were not privy to what he was saying. Those words were left deliberately ambiguous and mysterious. Here we do hear what he says, and we witness the underhand attack, the ambush, the surprise attack, if you like, the signal that Xu has given to his two henchmen to launch their attack. And here again we may remember the climax of Dragon Gate Inn, where, if you recall, the eunuch, the villainous eunuch, head of the Eastern group, was defeated by group effort, but specifically by a blow to the head, a blow to the forehead, which evidently concussed him and blurred his vision, changed his perception of things. That's precisely what's about to happen to this man, who is not a eunuch, but is the head of the Eastern group, Xu, and his perceptions are going to become crucial. In a way, he has become our surrogate the audience surrogate, the man whose perception we share in these climactic scenes of the film, in precisely the way that Gu was our audience surrogate in the earlier scenes. We perceive things through Gu's eyes, missing things when he missed them, seeing them when he saw them. Here we share the hallucinations of Xu, just as we did the hallucinations of the eunuch at the end of Dragon Gate Inn, again caused by a direct blow to the forehead, which we have to assume has damaged the brain to create altered consciousness. At this point, Hui Yuan, the abbot, has been stabbed, treacherously attacked in an underhand way. He removes at this point the dagger plunged into his torso, discards it, and the zoom in, once again a new thing in Chinese cinema, but probably largely indebted to the Italian Western for this convention, reveals that he's bleeding not blood but something gold-coloured. This, of course, can be perceived as Xu's hallucination. It doesn't have to be literally true. In fact, nothing that happens in the last stages of the film has to be literally true, not least the fact that Gu, reunited with the son who will carry forward the Gu family name, is presumably somewhere far away from this, locked in a forest, but kneels down, somehow aware, magically aware of what is going on this rocky outcrop, with vultures circling now above the dead. The subjectivity of these scenes, the fact that we are invited to share distorted and twisted perceptions of reality, which of course at this point leads Shu to kill his own lieutenants. I mean, the two loyal followers who've come with him now get mown down by him by mistake because he mistakes them for enemies. All of these subjective twists and turns are, I think, part of King's drive to find what he described in that bit I quoted as a taste of an experience. Basically, a way to communicate to the audience what it might be like to be caught up in something of this sort. Now, what Shu is caught up in is simple kind of madness, actually. It's a kind of a series of hallucinations, a series of paranoid hallucinations, which dominate the world around him. We can infer that he's dying, in fact, and that these are the hallucinations of a dying man. The switches of the image to negative, of course, are part of that too. So Shu leaps to his death from the rock, effectively committing suicide. But it's not clear in his deranged mind. It may well be that seeing Hui Yuan apparently achieve nirvana was enough to drive him mad. The birds circling overhead, the vultures circling overhead, seem to be real, not part of the hallucination, because they're still there after his death. And other people can see them, like Miss Yang. So we have a mixture here of the subjective perception and objective perception. But everybody, including us as viewers of the film, is now privy to the moment of what appears to be Hui Yuan achieving enlightenment. His last gesture as a human form is to point the way for Yang and any other survivor to their future. I think he's pointing them back to the monastery, in fact, but it's a more abstract kind of indication of take this path, take this way, take this road in life. But he has achieved in the lotus position, right in front of the sun, both as a sitting figure and as a standing figure. He has become a Buddha image. It doesn't mean he has become Buddha. It doesn't mean that, but just in the way that images you find in temples are not intended to be Buddha themselves, they are referred to as Buddha images. And he too has become a Buddha image. And as I say, it makes no difference if he's standing or sitting. His power reaches all of the others. It reaches Ms. Yang, it reaches General Shi, and it reaches Gu and his baby in the forest. And when he points, he indicates the way forward. It's an abstract indication that I have transcended my human existence. You humans who remain must take this path. And he points presumably in the direction of the monastery, which is what we glimpse here, both in positive and negative. The images dissolve at this point. Dissolves have been used rather sparingly in this film, which is on the whole a fast cut film. I mean, it varies very much from sequence to sequence, but broadly speaking, it's been a fast cut film. Here the dissolves take us out gently, learning by this analogy. We've been given a taste of a touch of Zen.